in GS3 Environment Marathon Mains 2026. So far we discussed 4 chapters: climate, finance and climate related governance, and then water and water related governance, and then environmental impact and impact assessment, that is environmental related governance, and that pollution in that air pollution and plastic waste, e-waste, solid waste management rules we discussed so far. In this, next we are going to discuss the chapter number 5, that is biodiversity, biodiversity and forests. And in this, we are going to discuss the biggest blind spot in the paper. Why? Here is a fact that should reshape how you prioritize. In 13 years of GS3 environment questions, 2013 to 2025, forest conservation has never been asked directly, not once. And yet, in the same window, India passed the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023. The Supreme Court intervened repeatedly to stop it, and the country's forest report revealed losses in its most fragile landscapes. A syllabus central theme here is a major legislative and judicial storm and zero questions so far. That is the single largest gap in the entire paper, which makes forest one of the strongest prediction zones for 2026. The chapter is where you build the edge no competitors notes will have. This is the biggest blind spot for the paper. So here the spine and applied to the living world. What is the spine? Damage, governance failure and remedy. So here first one, what is the damage? Deforestation, habitat fragmentation, species loss, degraded ecosystems. And second one, why is governance failing? Why is governance failing? Plantations counted as forests, communities excluded from conservation, definitions diluted. So, what is the remedy? Ecological restoration. Ecological restoration. Ecological restoration, community stewardship, rights based conservation. And the master reframe for this whole chapter, the one that scores everywhere. That is, UPSC now rewards ecological function over superficial metrics. Not tree count, but ecosystem health, not fortress exclusion, but coexistence. Hold that, function over metric, coexistence over exclusion. What is the FCAA 2023 and what changed? Start with the law at the center of the storm, that is the Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023, retitled the One Sanrakshan Evam Samvardhan Adhiniyam, amended the original Forest Conservation Act of 1980. It is most contentious provision, Section 1A, narrowed the definition of forest under the amendment. The Act's protection applies mainly to two categories: land officially notified as forest and land recorded as forest in government records on or after October 1980. The concern this raised is precise. It potentially removed protection from deemed forests, lands that are forests in character but not formally recorded as such, a category that could run to nearly 2 lakh square kilometers. The amendment also introduced exemptions for strategic projects within 100 kilometers of international borders, for security, infrastructure, and for zoos, safaris, and ecotourism. So, the diversion. Here the concern I am repeating again, it potentially removed protection from deemed forests. The land that are forests in character but not formally recorded as such, a category that could run to nearly 2 lakh square kilometers. The amendment also introduced exemptions for strategic projects within 100 kilometers of international borders for security infrastructure and for zoos, safaris, and ecotourism. The diversion record before the FC Act 1980, Forest Conservation Act 1980, about 4.2 million hectares of forest were diverted for non-forest use. In the 40 years after it, that fell to 1.5 million hectares. So evidence of how much the Act 1980 Act's broad protection achieved and why petitioners fear its dilution. So, what is the Godavarman legacy and the Supreme Court chain? To understand the challenge, to, to understand the challenge, you need the case that defines forests in India. In the land, in the landmark T Godavarman case of 1996, the Supreme Court ruled that forest must be understood by its dictionary meaning. That is, its natural, expansive sense, not merely land the government happened to label as forest. The expansive decision, the expansive definition protected vast areas of unclassified and deemed forests for decades. The 2023 amendment was seen as reversing Godavarman, narrowing forest back to the recorded category. So forest officers, retired forest officers and conservationists challenged its constitutionality. The judicial chain here is, and note it is still unfolding. Note it is unfolding. That is Feb 2024 SC interim order in 1996, Godavarman case. The Supreme Court issued in 2024 February, the Supreme Court issued an interim order directing that the broad Godavarman definition must hold until states complete the identification of forest lands. Through further orders culminating in 2025, the court reinforced this, holding that no forest land may be reduced without providing equivalent compensatory land first. What is the culmination? In 2025 reinforced no forest land, no forest land reduced without prior compensatory land, no forest land reduced without compensatory land. So, and critically, the constitutionality of the amendment has not been finally decided. Not been. This is a live continuing matter. Present it as ongoing and not settled, and flag that a final ruling could reshape the picture. So this is a textbook executive versus judiciary tension over an environmental definition. The scoring answer holds the balance. The government's stated aims, legal clarity, ease of doing, ease of doing business, afforestation, against the conservation concern that a narrowed definition expose India's deemed forests to diversions. Present the debate here is, present the debate, note the matter is unresolved in your answer. So this is all regarding about Godavarman versus amendment and still unresolved. This is probably the most important topic or debate or question for Mains 2026. Then, then what is ISFR 2023? The state of the forest. So anchor the debate in the data. The India State of Forest Report 2023, the latest official assessment from the Forest Survey of India gives the numbers. IFSR 2023, forest and tree cover 25.17% of geographical area, forest cover 21.76, tree cover 3.41%, total forest cover about 7,15,343 square kilometer, forest carbon stock 7,285 million tons, up 81.5 million tons since 2021. Mangrove cover 4,992 square kilometer, a decline of 7.43 square kilometer since 2021. First ever separate Western Ghats assessment, a loss of 58.22 square kilometers of forest over the decade. So read those last two carefully. Mangrove cover 4,992 square kilometer, a decline of 7.43 square kilometers since 2021. First ever separate Western Ghats assessment, a loss of 58.22 square kilometer of forest over the decade. Please remind this, please remember this. Remember, first ever separate Western Ghats assessment. So because they are analytical gold mine, headline forest cover rose, but mangroves declined, and the ecologically priceless Western Ghats lost forest. The aggregate hides the ecological reality, and there is a deeper measurement problem. A rise in forest cover can include commercial plantations and orchards, tree cover that is not ecologically a forest. So a rising number can mask a declining natural forest. That gap between metric and function is the bridge to the next scene. So forests as natural capital, India's national accounts now value forest carbon retention services at 2.63% of GDP. MOSPI 2025 according a natural capital farming capital framing, almost no competitor will bring a forest answer. So the deeper measurement problem here is a rise in forest cover can include commercial plantation and orchards, tree cover that it is not ecologically a forest. So a rising number can mask a declining natural forest. That gap between metric and function is the bridge to the next scene. So forests as natural capital, India's national accounts now value forest carbon retention services at 2.63% of GDP. A natural capital framing almost no competitor will bring to a forest answer. So restoration versus plantation. The central distinction here is the conceptual heart of the chapter and the top ranker differentiator. The average answer says to fix deforestation, plant more trees. This is the average answer. But the top answer says increasing tree cover is not the same as restoring a forest. Hold the distinction precisely. A plantation is often a single species planted for output and a short rotation. Under commercial control, measured by tree count, it may even reduce biodiversity. Ecological restoration use native diverse species, aims at ecosystem function over a long horizon under community and landscape governance measured by soil, water, species and resilience. It rebuilds habitat. So the governance danger is real. Commercial plantations counted as restoration toward carbon sink and afforestation targets. Monocultures replacing natural forest, compensatory afforestation that produces tree cover while destroying the original ecosystem, and on grassland actively harming it, as we will see next. So increasing tree cover does not necessarily amount to forest restoration. Restoration must be evaluated through ecological functionality, soil, water, species, and resilience, not through plantation or compensatory afforestation tree counts. This is the same metric versus function trap we met with wetland beautification in chapter 2. So we are going to discuss grasslands. Here we discussed increasing tree is not equal to restoring a forest, because plantation is different, forest is different. Because forest is ecological restoration through native diverse species, ecosystem function, long horizon, community landscape and governance, measured by soil water species resilience. Comes to plantation, often single species for output, short rotation and commercial control, measured by tree count, maybe even reduced by biodiversity. But forest is not. Forest is quite opposite to this. So we are moving to grasslands. The ecosystem we plant over. So now the strongest conceptual addition in this entire module, because it is understanded counterintuitive and exactly the depth UPSC prizes. India's environmental policy equates restoration with tree planting, but not every landscape is meant to have trees. Grasslands and the broader category of open natural ecosystems are ecosystem in their own right, not degraded forests waiting to be planted. Why grasslands matter? Why grasslands matter? They store most of their carbon below ground in roots and soil, which makes the carbon resilient to fire and drought, unlike above ground tree biomass. So they recharge groundwater, moderate floods, support to pollinators, sustain pastoral livelihoods, and thou high albedo, cool the local climate. These are the reasons. Then comes to the policy failure is fourfold. Grasslands are misclassified as wastelands in revenue records. The words itself invites their destruction. Tree plantation are planted on them. Tree plantations are planted on them, destroying the nave ecosystem. Pastoral communities lost their commons, and carbon finance rewards visible tree biomass over invisible soil carbon. So, afforestation of natural grasslands may increase tree count metrics while destroying the underlying functional ecosystem. It is subsurface carbon, its hydrology, and its pastoral commons. Comes to the way forward. What is the way forward here? The way forward, the way forward here is recognize open natural ecosystems as a distinct land category, not wasteland. Map them, include grassland carbon in national inventories, secure pastoral rights, and restore each ecosystem to its own natural state. Grasslands as grassland, not grasslands converted to plantation. A forest centric approach to climate mitigation can undermine grasslands biodiversity and pastoral livelihoods. A forest centric approach to climate mitigation can undermine grassland biodiversity and pastoral livelihoods. Bringing grasslands into a forest or afforestation answer signals ecological sophistication almost no candidate will show. So, a forest centric approach to climate mitigation can undermine grassland biodiversity and pastoral livelihoods. So, bringing grasslands into a forest or afforestation answer signals ecological sophistication almost no candidate will show. So, you have to write, you have to balance, you have to include these kind of things in your answers. You can get good marks. So, then we are moving to segment close. So the FCAA 2023 narrowed the definition of forest. The Supreme Court, invoking Godavarman, held the broad definition, and the constitutional question is still open. ISFR 2023 shows rising aggregate. ISFR 2023 shows rising aggregate cover, making masking mangrove and western Ghats mangrove and western Ghats losses, and the gap between tree cover and forests. The gap defines tree cover and the gap between tree cover and forest. The gap defines the chapter's core distinction, that is, plantation is not restoration. Function over metric. Plantation is not restoration. Function over metric. And grasslands prove the point most sharply. And grasslands prove the point most sharply. Planting trees on a grassland destroys an ecosystem while raising a tree count. Planting trees on a grassland destroys an ecosystem while raising a tree count. One reframe runs through it all. What is the reframe runs through it all? Ecological function over superficial metrics. But forests and grasslands are not empty landscapes. They are home to communities who have stewarded them for centuries. The next question is what? Whether conservation treats those communities as trespassers to be excluded or as partners to be empowered. That is the segment number 2, that is community conservation. Community conservation. The Rights Act and the Human Wildlife Conflict. From the fortress to coexistence. Segment 1 ended on a question, that is what? Are forest communities trespassers or partners? Are forest communities trespassers or partners? The answer UPSC now rewards is a decisive shift in the philosophy of conservation itself. For over a century, Indian conservation ran on the fortress model. Draw a boundary. What is the fortress model? I'm telling you, I am explaining you. This is draw a boundary, keep humans out, protect nature by exclusion. It produced protected areas, but at a cost. Displacement of forest dwellers, loss of local support, and conservation islands cut off from the landscapes around them. But the emerging model is conservation as coexistence. That is shifted. Communities as ecological stewards, not intruders. It rests on customary knowledge, livelihood linked conservation, rights based protection, benefit sharing, and decentralized community led monitoring. So, the future of wildlife conservation in India lies in coexistence rather than exclusion, rather than exclusion. The average answers defense protect areas. The top answers argues that conservation succeeds with communities, not against them. Because exclusion breeds the resentment that undermines conservation itself. So the Forest Rights Act, what is the Forest Rights Act and what is the community stewardship? The legal engine of coexistence is the Forest Rights Act of 2006. It recognized what colonial and post-colonial forest law had denied for over a century. It recognized what colonial and post-colonial forest law had denied for over a century. That forest dwelling communities and tribal groups, forest dwelling communities and tribal groups hold rights over the forests they had lived in and protected. Two categories matter for your answer here. That is individual forest rights, first one, then community forest resource rights. First one, the individual forest rights, the right to cultivate and dwell, and more powerfully, community forest resource rights, the right of Gram Sabha to protect, manage, and govern its community forest resources. That community forest resource right is transformative because it converts the community from a subject of forest governance into an agent of it. The decision maker, not the trespasser. This connects straight back to chapter 3's Niyamgiri case, where the Supreme Court let the Gram Sabhas decide on mining, and the Dongriya Kond voted to protect their sacred hills. That is the Forest Rights Act as a living instrument of coexistence. So, forest conservation in India cannot succeed without addressing livelihood insecurity and recognizing local communities as partners. The Forest Rights Act and especially community forest resource rights convert forest dwellers from a subjects of conservation into its agents into its agents. So that is poverty, degradation, and honest balance. Handle one argument carefully because a careless version loses marks. So there is a link between poverty and forest degradation. Poverty can deepen dependence on fuelwood, grazing, and minor forest produce. But the scoring answer refuses to blame the poor because large scale degradation comes overwhelmingly from powerful actors, not subsistence users. Mining, commercial infrastructure, dams, industrial plantations, encroachment by the influential, and diversion without adequate restoration. The forest dweller collecting firewood is not the driver of deforestation. The project clearing 1,000 hectares is the driver of deforestation. So the correct frame here is rights plus livelihood security plus ecological regulation plus community stewardship distinguish subsistence use from commercial extraction and a target regulation at the latter. So what is the way forward here? Recognize Forest Rights Act claims, recognize Forest Rights Act claims, strengthen community forest resource rights, provide clean cooking energy to reduce fuel dependence, build forest-based value chain and fair prices for minor forest produce, and enable community-led fire and biodiversity management. The trap is to frame conservation as protecting forests from poor people. The reframe here is correct, that is secure livelihoods and rights, and communities become conservation's most effective frontline because it is their forest to defend. So what is the human wildlife conflict, a landscape problem? Now one of the strongest understand themes, and it turns on a single reframe, that is human wildlife conflict is rising. Crop and livestock losses, human deaths and injuries, retaliatory killing of animals, and the slow erosion of local support for conservation. The the lazy framing. The lazy framing is animals are entering human areas. The correct framing is, and that one that scores, human wild is correct. This thing. Human wildlife conflict is a landscape governance failure produced by habitat fragmentation, blocked corridors, and incompatible land use, not merely rising animal numbers. So this is the way you have to write an answer. Human wildlife human wildlife conflict is landscape governance failure produced by the habitat fragmentation, blocked corridors, and incompatible land use, not merely rising animal numbers. So why it is worsening? Linear infrastructure, linear infrastructure, roads, railways, canals slicing through habitats, corridors between protected areas obstructed, trapping animals in shrinking islands, crop expansion right up to the forest edge, a depletion of natural prey, and climate driven food and water stress, and revealingly conservation success without landscape planning, conservation success without landscape planning, recovering tiger and elephant populations with nowhere to disperse. So the remedy here is landscape scale, not fence scale. Secure and restore, secure and restore wildlife wildlife corridors, plan beyond protected area boundaries, deliver rapid transparent compensation and insurance for losses. So communities do not bear the cost of conservation alone. Early warning systems, predator proof enclosures, and community response teams and benefit sharing from conservation and tourism, so that living near wildlife becomes an asset, not only a burden. So human wildlife conflict is increasingly consequence of fragmented landscapes rather than merely rising animal population. So its resolution lies in corridor connectivity and landscape level planning, supported by supported by rapid compensation, rapid compensation that keeps communities on the side of conservation. So conservation is shifting from fortress exclusion to coexistence. Communities as stewards, not trespassers. The Forest Rights Act and especially community forest resource rights make that shift legally real, converting forest dwellers into decision makers. Niyamgiri showed it in action. The poverty degradation link must be handled honestly. Target commercial extraction, not subsistence use. And human wildlife conflict is a landscape fragmentation problem solved by corridors and compensation. Not fence alone. The reframe holds here is coexistence over exclusion, partnership over policing. So we have covered forests, grasslands, and the communities within them. The final piece is the final piece is the living diversity itself. How India governs its biodiversity, shares its genetic wealth, and extracts the mineral beneath its forests without destroying them. That is the segment 3 biodiversity governance access and benefit sharing and the compressed mining and the critical minerals story. The biodiversity versus governance, not a species list. We have covered the forest and the community. Now the living diversity itself, and here UPSC shift is unmistakable. The old question asked you to list species and their status, but the new question asks how India governs its biodiversity. The institutions, the laws, the international commitments, the sharing of benefits. So do not memorize a catalog of animals. Master the governance architecture and note the timing. The last major biodiversity question was 2018. The Biological Diversity Act, 7 years untested, while the act was amended in 2023 and the global framework was rewritten in 2022. Like forests, biodiversity is significantly overdue. So a strong 2026 zone. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Start with the global frame that now anchors every biodiversity answer. Adopted in 2022, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is the biodiversity world's equivalent the Paris Agreement, a set of goals to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and live in harmony with nature by 2050. Four goals for 2050. What are the four goals? 23 targets for 2030. Two targets you must be able to name, that is target number 3, the 30 by 30 target. Conserve at least 30% of land, water, and marine areas by 2030. And target 19, that is finance, mobilize $200 billion a year for biodiversity by 2030, including 30 billion flowing to developing countries. The Kali outcome, COP 16, COP 16 2024, the Kali Fund, benefit sharing from digital sequence information on genetic resources. A permanent body for indigenous peoples and local communities. But the 20 billion US dollar finance strategy was not agreed, and only about 400 million US dollar was pledged. So the familiar north-south finance gap here reappearing in biodiversity. So what is the India's response? The updated NBSAP. India translated the global framework into a national plan. Cited precisely at the Kali Summit in 2024, India released its updated National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Its NBSAP for 2024 to 2030 aligned to the Kunming-Montreal framework. India's NBSAP 2024 23 national biodiversity targets across three themes: reducing threats, sustainable use, and tools for implementation. A whole of government, whole of society approach. Estimated financing need about 81,664 crore a year. Institutional backbone, a three-tier structure: the National Biodiversity Authority, state biodiversity boards, and local biodiversity management committees. That three-tier structure is the delivery machinery. And its weakest link, the Biodiversity Management Committee, is where we turn next. The Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing. Now, the concept that ties biodiversity to economics, and a strong standalone question. The Nagoya Protocol operationalizes the third objective of the Convention on Biological Diversity: the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. The Nagoya Protocol operationalizes the third objective of the Convention on Biological Diversity. That is what? The fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. The logic here is: a pharmaceutical or seed company that profits from a medicinal plant or a traditional variety must share those benefits with the community and a country that conserved the resource and the knowledge. Its mechanisms: name them: prior informed consent, mutually agreed terms, protection of traditional knowledge, and increasingly the contested question of digital sequence information, the genetic data, which can now be used without physically taking the resource. Why does this matter intensively for India? India is biodiversity rich: medicinal plants, agricultural land races, deep reservoirs of tribal and local knowledge, and therefore a prime target for biopiracy. Access and benefit sharing is the shield against biological resource being patented abroad without consent or compensation. But the governance is genuinely difficult, and the balance is the answer. Overlay complex approvals can discourage legitimate research and biotechnology. Communities are often unaware of their rights. Biodiversity management committees and people's biodiversity registers remain weak, and identifying the rightful beneficiaries of shared traditional knowledge is hard. So India updated this architecture through the Biological Diversity Act of 2023, which eased compliance of Ayush practitioners and researchers and decriminalized offences welcomed by industry, but criticized for potentially diluting benefit sharing safeguards. So India must reconcile the ease of biological research and biotechnology led growth with fair benefit sharing and protection against biopiracy. The Nagoya Protocol and a strengthened access and benefit sharing regime built on functionally biodiversity management committees are the instruments for the balance. How does biodiversity vary in India? How is the Biological Diversity Act 2002 helpful in conservation of flora and fauna? So this is the question asked in 2018 15 marker question. The 2026 upgrade fuses this tested theme with ABS, the 2023 amendment, and the Nagoya Protocol. So you have to be very careful with this. And then comes to mining and critical minerals. Now the compressed mining story, that is compressed because it was tested directly in 2025. So a generic repeat is unlikely, but the theme has evolved and the new angle is critical minerals. So first the enduring mining hazards, keeping this tight: deforestation, habit fragmentation, river and groundwater pollution, soil erosion, slope instability, dust, and abandoned mine hazards. Consequences: the governance failures, the contractor official political nexus, weak district enforcement, underreported extraction, poor mine closure, poor mine closure planning, and the vocabulary shift this chapter has taught throughout. The remedy is not just control but ecological restoration and mine closure. Restoration bonds closure planning and rehabilitation as legal obligation. Now the 2026 evolution, critical minerals, the clean energy transition runs on lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths, the minerals inside every battery, solar panel, and wind turbine. Whoever controls them controls the transition. So comes to critical minerals. National Critical Mineral Mission Jan 2025, 16,300 crore outlay, securing the full value chain, exploration, mining, processing, recycling. MMDR amendments enabling central auction of critical mineral blocks and private exploration. Kabil acquiring lithium aggregate in Argentina, partnerships in Australia and Chile, budget 2026-2027, rare earth corridors in Odisha, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu for domestic mining, processing and manufacturing, and carry the material intensity insight from the economic survey. Clean energy is material hungry. A single gigawatt of wind needs roughly 2,866 tons of copper. So the green transition has its own mining footprint, which is why domestic processing, recycling, and the service argument that developing countries be treated as co-producers of value, not raw material suppliers, all matter. So the sophisticated line here is clean technology is not automatically clean, not automatically clean, not automatically green. Its full life cycle, the land, water, minerals it consumes must be assessed. Not just its low carbon output, the same life cycle logic returns in chapter 6 with renewable energy trade-offs. Mining is an environmental hazard and remedial measures. Question asked in 2025 10 markers. Consequence of illegal mining. Go no go zones. Asked in 2013 10 marker. Mining was just tested, so keep it compressed but update it with the restoration, mine closure, and the critical mineral dimension. So we opened on the biggest gap in the syllabus, forests untested in 13 years, the FCAA 2023. The Godavarman definition, the still open Supreme Court question, and the ISFR 2023. We drew the central distinction. Plantation is not restoration and pushed to its the sharpest edge in grasslands where planting trees destroys an ecosystem. We shifted conservation from fortress to coexistence. The Forest Rights Act, community forest resource rights, and human wildlife conflict as a landscape problem. And we closed on governance, the Kunming-Montreal framework, India's NBSAP, the Nagoya Protocol and ABS, and the compressed mining and critical minerals story. Two reframes carried the whole chapter, that is, ecological function over superficial metrics and coexistence over exclusion. So comes to the final thing, that is run it through the spine. That is first one, damage, deforestation, fragmentation, biopiracy, mining scars. Then second one, governance failure, diluted definitions, fortress exclusion, weak BMCs, biodiversity management committees, PMCs means absent mine closure. And the remedy what? Ecological restoration, community stewardship, benefit sharing, and closure obligations, mine closure obligations. So this is all about biodiversity, forest function over metric, coexistence over exclusion. So next chapter 6 brings the paper full circle. That is back to climate, but now it's a human face, adaptation, extreme heat, and building resilience against disasters that are no longer distant risks but present realities. So the sixth chapter, climate adaptation, heat and disaster resilience. Heat and disaster resilience. So climate's human face. Chapter 1 opened the marathon with climate as a problem of targets and finance. Chapter 6 closes it with climate as a problem of people. The human face of the crisis we begin with. Because for India, the sharpest climate reality is not the mitigation lecture. It is the farmer facing a failed monsoon, the construction worker laboring through a 47-degree afternoon, the coastal family watching the sea move inland, the mountain village below a swelling glacial lake. This is adaptation, and the argument of this chapter is that for a developing country on the front line of climate impacts, adoption is not the junior partner to mitigation. So it is the cornerstone. So recall the line from chapter 1. Development is in itself a form of adaptation. That is the thesis we now build it. The spine here is applied to the adaptation. So run the spine. What damage? First one is what damage? Heat, floods, drought, glacial risk, coastal loss. Impacts already arriving. Then second one, why is governance failing? Adaptation underfunded. Advisory not enforceable. Resilience treated as an afterthought. Third one, what a remedy? Adaptation finance, enforceable rights, resilience built in farm, resilience built in from the start. And note the vocabulary this chapter demands most demands most resilience, not preventing the shock, which is often no longer possible, but building the capacity to withstand it. From prevention to preparedness, from relief to resilience. So, why adaptation is the front line? Establish why adaptation deserves top billing in India's climate strategy. India's contribution to the problem is small. Per capita emissions of about 2.9 tons, well under half of the global average. But India's exposure to the consequence is among the highest in the world. Why? And adaptation has an advantage mitigation lacks. Adaptation has an advantage mitigation lacks. It delivers immediate local benefits. A restored mangrove projects a restored mangrove protects a village this cyclone season. A heat action plan saves lives the summer. Mitigation is a global long-term public good. Adaptation is a local near-term protection. So that is why India frames adaptation as development led, woven into water, agriculture, health, and urban planning, funded primarily from domestic public investment. The adaptation finance gap. Development countries need an estimated 3 ton, 310 to $365 billion a year by 2035 for adaptation. Actual international adaptation finance flowing to them only about 26 billion. 98% of India's adaptation finance is domestic. 98% of India's adaptation finance is domestic. A sign of self-reliance, but also the international support has failed to arrive. India's adaptation spending rose from 3.7% of GDP financial year 16 to 5.6% financial year 2022. So India's climate policy has advanced significantly on mitigation commitments, but adaptation remains institutionally and financially weaker, despite adaptation offering the immediate local protection that a highly climate vulnerable lower per capita emitter most needs. So the agriculture adaptation, the architecture of adaptation. Name the machinery because a governance answer needs institution. At the national level, the National Action Plan on Climate Change runs through 9 missions. The solar energy efficiency, sustainable habitat, water, the Himalayan ecosystem, Green India, sustainable agriculture, strategic knowledge, and health. Many of them adaptation focused. At the state level, state action plans on climate change translate these into these two local conditions and note their evolution, which is itself examinable. Early plans 2010 to 15 were mitigation oriented and stand alone. The newer plans are adaptation led, built on district level risk analysis, integrated with finance and planning departments, converging with flagship schemes on water, agriculture, and urban resilience. The tell of a strong adaptation answer. State action plans have evolved from mitigation documents to development integrated adaptation frameworks. That evolution, standalone to mainstreamed, is the governance story examiners reward. And on the ground, adaptation increasingly means ecosystem based measures. MISTI, MISTI for mangroves, coastal missions, wetland restoration, the nature based solutions we made chapter 2, now serving adaptation directly. So, heat, heat from weather forecast to human rights crisis. Now, the strongest, most current theme in this chapter, and one of the strongest untested themes in the whole paper. For decades, a heat wave was a weather event, an advisory, a warning to drink water. That framing is now dangerously inadequate. Extreme heat has become a public health, labor rights, and urban justice crisis. Consider the scale of exposure. India outdoor workforce for construction, agriculture, logistics, street vending is a huge share of total employment. So these are people who cannot stop working when the temperature crosses 45 degrees because a day not worked is a day not paid. And the threat is physiological, not just uncomfortable. The measures that matters is the wet bulb temperature. Heat combined with humidity above a wet bulb threshold, the body cannot cool itself by sweating, and prolonged exposure becomes lethal even for a healthy person in the shade. So, heat is simultaneously a health crisis, heat stroke, cardiovascular and kidney stress, maternal and child risk, a labor and economic crisis, lost productivity, lost wages, lost work days, and a justice crisis, the poor work outdoors, live in heat trapping informal housing, and lack access to cooling. So, heat waves in India have become an issue of public health, labor rights, and urban justice rather than merely disaster management. The average, the average answer says distribute water and issue heat alerts. The top answer demands enforceable thermal safety rights. So, strongest untested theme, that is heat from weather forecast to human rights crisis. This is health first impact, then labor and economy, and then justice. So comes to wet bulb temperature above 45, cold, cool by sweating. Cases: Ahmedabad heat insurance 354 premium, Jodhpur cooling station 80 degrees cooler, cooling paradox, solve adaptation and mitigation. The cooling paradox and the governance gap. Two sharp points that lift a heat answer above the ordinary. First point, the cooling demand paradox. As heat rises, air conditioning demand surges. But on a fossil heavy grid, the cooling burns more fossil fuel, which warms the climate further, which drives more cooling. Adaptation feeding mitigation failure. A vicious loop. A vicious loop. The escape is efficient cooling, cool roofs, passive design, and clean power. Adaptation and mitigation solved together are not at all. And the second one, the legislative vacuum, which is the governance failure movement of the spine. India's heat action plans are largely advisory, not legally binding. Not legally binding. Heat index threshold carry no enforceable force. Gig and contract workers fall outside effective occupational protection. There is no wage loss compensation for days too hard to work. It is not yet mainstreamed into building codes, labor law, or urban planning. The reform, therefore, is a shift from seasonal advisories to enforceable thermal safety rights. Legally backed heat action. Legally backed heat action plans. Wettable band heat index thresholds that trigger work rest shade water protocols. Work rest shade water protocols. Midday work restrictions with wage protection. Cool roofs, public cooling centers, urban tree canopy, and parametric heat insurance that pays out automatically when temperature crosses a threshold. So, adaptation in action. Ahmedabad, first South Asian city with a heat action plan in 2013. Parametric heat insurance for women workers, premium 354, payout 750 to 1250. Jodhpur, net zero community cooling station, about 8 degrees cooler during peak afternoon hours. These are the concrete named examples that turn a general heat answer into a scoring one. India must to move from non-binding seasonal heat advisories to enforceable thermal safety rights. Wet bulb thresholds, work rest cycles, wage protection, and parametric insurance. Recognizing heat stress as an economic and human rights shock, not only a healthy event. Heat is comes to the PYQ corner. Heat is untested as a standalone theme, which given its 2024-2025 prominence, make it one of the strongest prediction zones for 2026. It also links to the 2017 question on climate impacts across India and the 2023 sea level question as physical risk theme. So that is why heat is most important for 2026 mains examination. Adaptation is India's frontline, immediate local development led, yet it remains underfunded. 98% financed domestically because international support has not arrived. Its architecture that NAPCC missions the evolving state action plans is shifting from mitigation oriented to development integrated, and its sharpest edge is heat, now a public health, labor rights, and justice crisis, demanding a move from advisories to enforceable thermal safety rights, while the cooling paradox insists adaptation and mitigation be solved together. From prevention to resilience, from advisory to right. The reframe from prevention to resilience, from advisory to right. But heat is only one climate shock. Glaciers are retreating, forests are burning, cities are flooding, and the infrastructure we build today lacks in vulnerability for decades. How India prepares for those disasters and whether it builds resilience in or bolts it on segment number two. That is from relief to resilience. Segment 1 was about the slow pervasive shock of heat. Segment 2 is about the sudden catastrophic ones. Glacial floods, forest fires, urban deluges, and the infrastructure that must withstand them. And there is one master shift that governs the entire segment. The same reframe our locked structure demands. The average answer says what? Deploy relief and the disaster force. But the top answer says India must move from relief centric system to an anticipatory resiliency based one. From responding after the disaster to building the capacity to withstand it before. So that is relief to resilience, response to anticipation, hold that through every scene. So the Himalayan, Cryosphere, glacial, lake floods. start at the roof of the country, because Himalayan disasters are where climate change, geology, and reckless development collide. Himalayan glaciers feed India's great rivers. They are the water towers for irrigation, drinking water, and hydropower for hundreds of millions downstream. As the climate warms, these glaciers retreat, and the retreat creates a specific growing hazard. Melt water pools behind unstable natural dams of rock and ice. The Himalayan glaciers feed India's great rivers. They are water towers for irrigation, drinking water, and hydropower for hundreds of millions downstream. As the climate warms, these glaciers retreat, and the retreat creates a specific growing hazard. Meltwater pools behind unstable natural dams of rock and ice, forming glacial lakes. When such a dam fails, the lake bursts. A glacial lake outbursts flood a GLOF, sending a wall of water and debris down the valley with almost no warning. But note the crucial analytical point here is these are not purely natural disasters. They are compounded by development, road cutting, and tunneling that destabilize young fragile slopes, hydropower projects built in the flood path, construction that violates the region's carrying capacity. Region's carrying capacity. The very concept from chapter number 3. So the framing that scores Himalayan disasters are produced by the interaction of natural fragility, climate change, and inappropriate development, not by anyone alone. The governance response here is what? Glacial lake inventories and monitoring. India has approved a GLOF mitigation program under the National Disaster Mitigation Fund, basin level planning, reassessment of hydropower risk, early warning systems, and regulation of constructions in unstable zones. Himalayan glacier retreat is simultaneously a water security, disaster risk, and developmental planning challenge. It is disasters arise from the interaction of natural fragility, climate change, and carrying capacity violations, not from natural causes alone. So comes to the forest fires under the northeast. Move from ice to fire, a hazard that links back to the forests of chapter 5. Forest fires are intensifying, driven by prolonged dry spells, rising temperatures, and the accumulation of leaf litter and bamboo as fuel. In the northeast, they carry a distinctive challenge: steep, remote terrain that firefighting cannot as easily reach, high biodiversity sensitivity, and the complex role of traditional shifting cultivation, whose escaped fires can spread. The remedy blends the modern and the community based, exactly the balance UPSC rewards. Early detection through satellites and drones, AI based fire spread modeling, fuel load management, clearing the litter that feeds fires, and crucially community fire brigades, because the first responder in a remote forest is always the local community, not a distant agency. Forest fire management in India must combine modern early warning technology, satellites, drones, AI fire spread models with community-based landscape management, because in remote terrain, the community is always the first responder. So urban floods. What is urban floods? Urban floods and a governance failure. Come down from the mountains to the city, where the flood is less an act of nature than a failure of planning. Bengaluru, Chennai, Mumbai, the pattern repeats. It connects directly to chapter 2's wetlands. Cities flood because they have destroyed the systems that once absorbed water. Wetlands and lakes encroached, wetlands and lakes encroached and built over natural drainage, concretized, impervious surfaces sealing the ground. So solid waste choking the storm drains and fragmented metropolitan governance where no single body is accountable. So urban flooding is a match. So urban flooding is a much a governance failure as a meteorological event. The same line we used for day zero, and it holds here too. The extreme rainfall is the extreme rainfall is the trigger. The vulnerability is man-made. The remedy is the spongicity approach. Restore the blue-green network that lets water spread and soak. Protect and revive lakes and floodplains. Zone floodplains against construction, ward level vulnerability, mapping and blue-green infrastructure. So urban flooding in India is a much India as much a governance failure as a meteorological event. Cities that erase their wetlands, concretize drainage, and choke storm drains with waste convert every heavy monsoon into a disaster of their own making. So we are moving to disaster resilient infrastructure, the DPR principle. Now the reform idea that unifies this whole segment, and it is a strong 2026 hook. Every road, bridge, port, and power plant we build locks in risk for decades. A poorly sited asset will be damaged, rebuilt, and damaged again, draining public finance and disrupting the services people depend on. The failure is one of sequencing. Resilience is usually added after a project is conceived, financed, designed, and cited, bolted on as an afterthought when the vulnerability is already baked in. The reform is to move resilience upstream to the very first stage, the detailed project report, screen every major project for major hazard climate risk before it is approved, not after it is built. The differentiator straight from our answer enrichment layer. Average answer relief and disaster force deployment. But top answer disaster resilience must be screened at the detailed project report stage, treated as a core criteria of infrastructure appraisal, not an additional cost. This is the life cycle logic we met with ocean, we met with clean technology in chapter 5. Assesses the whole life of the asset, not just as immediate output. The toolkit here is mandatory multi-hazard risk assessment, climate adjusted design standards, life cycle costing, insurance and catastrophe bonds, and independent resilience audits. Disaster resilience must be treated as a core criteria of infrastructural appraisal from the detailed project report stage onward, not as an additional cost bolted on after siting and design when vulnerability is already locked in for the asset's lifetime. So we begin with the adaptation as India's frontline, underfunded, development led, and sharpest in the heat crisis, where the reform is enforceable thermal safety rights. We moved to the sudden shocks, Himalayan GLOFs, bonds of fragility, warming and reckless development, forest fires needing technology and community together, urban floods, a governance failure dressed as a weather event, and we closed on the unifying reform. Disaster resilient infrastructure resilience risk screened in farm from the DPR stage. DPR DPR stage. One reframe carried through the chapter, from relief to resilience, from response to anticipation, from advisory to right. Run it through the spine one last time. That is damage. Damage, heat, floods, fires, glacial risk all arriving now. Governance failure, advisory not enforceable, relief centric, resilience bolted on late. Comes to remedy part. Thermal safety rights, anticipatory action, community response, resilience by design. And with that, the six content chapters are complete. Climate, water, governance, pollution, biodiversity, and adaptation. The whole of GS3 environment current to 2026. What remains is to consolidate. Chapter 7 is a rapid revision recap. The 12 current affairs developments you must carry into the examination hall. Each mapped to the answer it belongs to. So the we are moving to the chapter number 7. The chapter number 7, Ultra Probable Current Affairs Recap. How to use this recap? The final chapter contains no new content. Everything here was taught inside chapters 1 to 6. What this recap does different and important. UPSC does not test current affairs in isolation. It fuses a development into a static answer. The NDC inside a climate question, the NCAP inside an air pollution. So UPSC does not test current affairs in isolation. It fuses a development into a static answer. The NDC inside a climate question, NCAP inside an air pollution question. So the skill this recap builds is not recall of the development. It is knowing which answer each development belongs to. 12 developments for each one line on what it is and one line on where it plugs in. Carry these into the exam hall as your currency markers. The details that signal to the examiner that your answer is current to 2026, not recycled from a 2-year old handout. Let us run them. The climate cluster. First one, the climate cluster. Climate cluster. 1. India's NDC 3.0, the single most important marker. The new nationally determined contribution for 2013, 2031 to 35. 47 emissions intensity cut, 60% non-fossil capacity, a 3.5 to 4 billion ton carbon sink. Cabinet approved March 2026, submitted to the UN April 2026. And the killer supporting fact here is India already crossed 52.57% non-fossil in February 2026, meeting the 50% target 5 years early. Plugs into any climate commitments question, opens with it. You can write these lines in your any climate commitment question, open with that. The second one, COP30 Belém. COP30 Belém. Article 9.1, the November 2025 summit agreed a 2-year work program on Article 9.1, reasserting climate finance as a treaty obligation of developed countries, not private investment relabeled. You can use it into climate finance and climate negotiation answers. The Belém 30. The third one, the carbon credit trading scheme and the Surat proof. India's carbon market with emission intensity targets now notified for 4 sectors. And the Surat particulate matter market, the world's first delivering 20 to 30 emissions, 30% emissions, emission cuts at lower cost. It can use into plugs into carbon market answers, and the Surat example works in air pollution answers to. Fourth one, that is the draft climate finance taxonomy. Finance Ministry May 2025 still draft classifying genuinely green activities to prevent greenwashing, built on India's own development pathway, not Western thresholds. Plugs into climate finance and greenwashing answers. Then the governance and pollution cluster. The governance and pollution clusters. The 5. The 2025 environmental reform wave. Parivesh 3.0 single window clearance environment audit rules 2025 with third party auditors. The new blue industry category and Genwish was decriminalization, penalties replacing imprisonment. The frame here is a shift to trust based governance, powerful but only as good as its deterrences, plugs into EIA and environmental governance answers. The sixth one is NCAP. NCAP at its decline. Sorry, NCAP at its deadline. The National Clean Air Program's 40% target falls due in 2025-2026. The exam here carry both numbers. Official progress on PRANA against Prana against the independent audit. Only a minority of cities met the target. Delhi still at 197 micrograms. Plugs into air pollution answers the government versus audit contrast is the scoring move. The seventh one is the solid waste management rules 2026. Notified January 2026, effective April, 4 stream segregation, bulk generator responsibility, circular economy model. The critic here is success depends on municipal capacity and behavior, not rule design. This can be used into solid waste and circular economy answers. Then we are moving to next one, that is biodiversity and forest cluster. So eighth one is the Kunming-Montreal framework and India's NBSAP. The Global Biodiversity Framework 30 by 30 and the $200 billion finance target and India's updated NBSAP 2024 with 23 national targets plus the Nagoya Protocol and access the benefit sharing as the biopiracy shield plugs into biodiversity governance answer the 2018 Biodiversity Act theme upgraded. And the ninth one is the Forest Conservation Amendment Act. Forest Conservation Amendment Act. And the Supreme Court, the 2023 amendment narrowed the definition of forest. The Supreme Court held the broad Godavarman definition, and the constitutionality question is still open. Present it as live, plugs into forest governance answer. The biggest untested gap in the paper. The 10th one is critical minerals. Critical minerals, NCMM, rare earth corridors, the National Critical Mineral Mission, the NCMM, and the budget 2026 rare earth corridors in 4 mineral rich states, plus the insight that clean energy has its own mining footprint. So it should be plugs into mining answers updating the 2025 hazard theme and into energy transition answers. Then moving to adaptation and frontier cluster. Adaptation and frontier cluster. 11, that is CCUS, the funded commitment. Budget 2026 proposed a 20,000 crores CCUS outlay across hard to abate sectors. The technology side of the CCUS versus carbon farming debate plugs into carbon market and hard to abate decarbonization answers. So that is CCUS. Next one is planetary framing. The 7 of 9 boundaries breached. The 2025 planetary health check. 7 of 9 planetary boundaries crossed. Ocean acidification, the newest. Use it as elevation. The scale of the crisis, but never let it tip into anti-development romanticism. So plugs in as a powerful opening or closing framing any climate or ecological essay. And two more to keep in reserve, that the Shanti Act, nuclear. The Shanti Act opening nuclear to private participation for energy transition answers and the state of India's environment 2026 headline findings for general framing. The master frame, revising the whole paper before we close, compress the entire entire marathon into what you actually carry into the hall. Every answer runs on one spine. Three movements. What is the ecological damages? Why is governance failing? What institutions, technology, and communities remedies are required? Damage, governance, failure, remedy. Every answer is lifted by one vocabulary shift from control to restoration, from disposal to circularity, from relief to resilience, from advisory to right, and every answer is separated from the average by one instinct, function over metric, not recount but ecosystem health, not capacity but generation, not the scheme but its implementation, not solve it in isolation but solve adaptation and mitigation together. Spine, vocabulary, instinct carry those three, and the specific facts arrange themselves. So we have traveled the whole of GS3 environment. Chapter 1 Climate, the Paradox, NDC 3.0 Finance, Carbon Markets. Then Chapter 2 Water is the largest theme, from groundwater to day zero cost, day zero to the coast. Chapter 3 Governance, EIA carrying capacity. The 2025 reforms and one thesis, not the absence of law, but the failure of implementation. Chapter 4 Pollution and Waste, air at the airshed scale, waste in a circular economy. Chapter 5 Biodiversity and Forests, the biggest gap in the paper, function over metric, coexistence over exclusion. Chapter 6 Adaptation, Climate's Human Face, from heat rights to resilient infrastructure. Six chapters, one paper, current to 2026. Carry these tricks: spine, vocabulary, instinct. What is the spine? What damages? Why is governance failing? What remedies? Every single answer. Comes to vocabulary: control to restoration, disposal to security, circularity, relief to resilience, advisory to right. And instincts: function over metric, not recount, ecosystem wealth, not capacity but generation, not scheme but implementation. So six chapters, one paper, current to 2026. Remember what UPSC is really asking beneath every question: what damage? Why is governance failing? What must be done? Answer in the language of restoration, circularity, resilience, and rights. Choose function over metric every time. Prepare the concept. Prepare the concept, not the clutter, not the clutter. Prepare the mechanism, not the memory dump. That is how this paper is won. That completes the GS3 Environment Marathon for Mains 2026. All the best to the examination.